DHS says Lemon has been charged with federal civil rights crimes. Professor Emeritus at Harvard Law School, Alan Dershowitz, joins me. Nice to see you, Professor.
Thanks for having me.
All right, where is the line between a journalist's First Amendment right to cover a story and freedom of the press and the line where you become an aider and abetter and become part of the principal crime?
Well, the line ought to be resolved in close cases in favor of the First Amendment, in favor of journalism. Look, there are extreme cases. We know that in Gaza, Hamas members were wearing journalist jackets and pretending to be journalists and having a camera in one hand and a gun in the other hand. That's an easy case. You know, Don Lemon, who I've known for years, is a real journalist. He may have points of view. He may be a biased journalist, but the First Amendment doesn't distinguish between biased journalists and objective journalists. Walter Cronkite is not the paradigm of the First Amendment. Anybody who purports to be reporting has the benefit of journalism, and they have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that he was a co-conspirator, that he was part of an effort to disrupt a church service. I think they're going to have a very hard time proving that beyond a reasonable doubt to a Minnesota jury.
What would it take, I'm just hypothetically, not Don Lemon, but to become an aider and abetter? I mean, what would you have had to do beforehand where you crossed that line?
Well, you have to have a recorded conversation, perhaps, in which they ask him to please come and join the demonstration and give credibility to the demonstration. That might cross the line. Or if he did anything to confront, say, the pastor and scream at the pastor the way some of the people did, saying, oh, my God, you know, you can't be complicit with ICE. Those might cross the line. It doesn't seem, from what I've seen from the evidence, that this crosses the line. It may cross the line of journalistic ethics, but there's an enormous difference between violating journalistic ethics, if he did, I'm not sure he did, but if he did in this case, and being able to have proof beyond a reasonable doubt that he was a co-conspirator and somebody who was complicit in the illegal violations. Look, it's a hard case even for the protesters. Martin Luther King, you know, protested in churches. Of course, he was willing to accept the consequences. He went to the Birmingham jail and wrote one of the most beautiful letters ever written from a prison. These guys are not Martin Luther King. And so they're more like, in some ways, the people who were trying to prevent integration in the South in the 1960s and preventing federal agents from desegregating the South. So this is complex, but my prediction is it will not end in a criminal conviction for Don Lemon.
Is it possible, and hypothetically, I'm just laying out hypothetical because this is just very early on and the First Amendment is such a strong protected right, is it possible that one could start out as a journalist with all the protections of the First Amendment, but then once inside, is there something that you could do that sort of will convert you from having the shield of the First Amendment, or the protection of the First Amendment, to being the aider and abetter?
Yes, there's no doubt there are things you can do, but I haven't seen from the videos any evidence that Don Lemon did them. But if you really got into the face of the pastor and personally disrupted the church service, you might be violating the face statute and other statutes that probably will be part of the indictment against Don Lemon. But remember, too, you have to realize this is going to be a jury of people from a state that is not particularly sympathetic to ICE and is apparently more sympathetic to protesters. So this is going to be a hard case, and one wonders why the Justice Department decided to bring it in context where it's very likely that they in the end will not win.
Well, the DOJ wanted to bring this. They went to a magistrate, couldn't get an arrest warrant, said they saw insufficient evidence. Then it went to a federal district court judge, same answer. But then I think it went to a grand jury. So those citizens that you're talking about who were unwilling, you know, who are not sympathetic to ICE, apparently were looking at the evidence that I have no idea what was shown them or not shown them behind closed doors, had a different view.
Yeah, and, you know, as the chief judge of New York Court of Appeals once said, a grand jury can be persuaded to indict a ham sandwich if you present only a partial view of the evidence. If you, for example, don't tell the grand jurors that he's a journalist, if you just show a picture of him along with other people and leave out that fact, that could easily result in an indictment. Ultimately, the defense, and by the way, Abby Lowell is a great defense attorney. I've worked with him on cases in the past. You couldn't get a better lawyer for a case like this. He will eventually get a hold of the grand jury minutes and will be able to see whether or not there was a fair grand jury determination. It might result in a dismissal of the indictment if there wasn't.
All right, the other people there, not Don Lemon, but the other people there, what about them? Was that a crime, going into and making that noise? That trespass? Is that violating the civil rights of these people's right to worship? Tell me, what is that?
That is a crime, and it's a constitutional crime, constitutionally permissible crime. You can't disrupt a church service. The First Amendment does not allow you to go into a church and say, you know, Jesus Christ didn't exist, or God is dead. You can say it outside the church, but you can't disrupt the church service, and you can't go into a church and accuse the minister of being complicit in crimes with ICE. You can do it outside. You can hand out leaflets, but you can't disrupt the church service. And the evidence strongly suggests that there's enough here to convict people who are not journalists of improperly and illegally disrupting a church service.
Well, it's sort of interesting. This is where the cameras come in. Everybody with a cell phone these days, because, you know, the protesters who did go in, I'm not talking about Don Lemon, but the protesters who did go in, they're all on some camera someplace. I mean, because nobody escapes these iPhones.
Yeah, and that helps, obviously, produce justice in criminal cases, because the camera doesn't lie, but camera angles do show different aspects of it. And we have to know which camera pictures were shown to the grand juries, because there'll be more pictures shown in a trial, because the defense has the opportunity to present its evidence there as well, whereas the defense does not present evidence to a grand jury.
Well, where I'm hung up, and this is where it's a wait and see, is, you know, is what the grand jury heard, and if there's something different from, you know, from this, and see, you know, if they have other information. But we'll have to wait and see, because the magistrate didn't have all the information, and the federal court judge that the grand jury may have had, but we have no idea at this point. So we'll have to wait and see. Alan Dershowitz, thank you, sir.
Thanks for having me.
People think news just happens. It doesn't. It happens because there's someone there to capture the moment, to explain it and share it. That's my job. I go where news breaks and give you the facts. Join me for The Record on Newsmax.